The West spent 2 centuries trying to open China. They succeeded so well that the door they opened became a one-way street. This is how the global hunt for Chinese consumers accidentally turned the world's factory into the world's bank. There is a number that haunted Western merchants, industrialists, and statesmen for nearly 200 years. Not a secret formula. Just this, for 100 million people. In the 1840s, a British textile manufacturer sat down and did the math. If every person in China bought just one cotton shirt, just one, he would never need another customer again. The mills of Manchester could run forever. He was not alone. The same arithmetic infected diplomats, ship captains, and bankers across Europe and America. China was not just a country. It was a dream wearing the shape of a country. A market so enormous that cracking it open would solve every manufacturer's problem. Too much supply, not enough buyers, overnight. The British called it the China market fantasy. Then they spent the next century trying to make it real. When reality pushed back, they pushed harder. The first push came in the form of cannons. By the late 1700s, Britain had a serious problem. The British loved Chinese tea, porcelain, and silk, but China had no interest in buying anything British in return. Emperor Qianlong told King George III that China possesses all things in prolific abundance and had no need of foreign goods. Britain was bleeding silver. The East India Company needed a fix. They found one in a poppy field. Opium, grown in British-controlled India, was the one thing Chinese consumers would buy. By 1838, over 30,000 chests were flooding into China each year. Addiction spread through coastal cities. Silver reversed course and flowed east. China tried to stop it. Commissioner Lin Zexu destroyed over 1 million kilograms of British opium and wrote a polite letter to Queen Victoria asking her to simply end the trade. The letter was ignored. British warships were not. The First Opium War ended in 1842 with the Treaty of Nanking, the first of China's unequal treaties. 5 ports forced open. Hong Kong seized. Britain given automatic most favored nation status. France, America, Russia lined up behind Britain and extracted their own deals. China's coastline filled with foreign settlements where Westerners lived beyond Chinese law. All of this, the wars, the treaties, the humiliation, was done in the name of market access. In the name of those 400 million consumers. And it still did not work. Because the Chinese farmer that British manufacturers imagined buying their shirts earned a few cents a day. He could not afford one. The fantasy had always confused population with purchasing power. 400 million poor people are not a market. China spent the next century in crisis, the collapse of the Qing dynasty, warlordism, Japanese invasion, civil war. By 1949, when Mao declared the People's Republic, the country had been in some form of conflict for over 100 years. For 30 years after that, the China market fantasy went on ice. Trade embargoes. A closed economy. The West could not reach those consumers, and China was not interested in being reached. Then in 1978, a small, unassuming man named Deng Xiaoping changed everything. Deng had survived the Cultural Revolution, barely. He had watched Mao's experiments leave hundreds of millions in poverty. His conclusion was blunt. China was poor because it had closed itself off. The fix was to open up, but carefully, on China's terms, with a specific purpose. His policy was called reform and opening up. Its genius was in how it used the West's obsession against itself. The fantasy that had never quite come true, all those hundreds of millions of consumers, became the bait. Western companies would be lured in by the promise of the market. But they would not simply sell things to China. China would learn to make what they were selling. Western companies entered China with open eyes. They knew the rules. Joint ventures with Chinese state-owned partners. Technology transfer requirements. Local staffing mandates. They accepted the conditions because the market was too large to ignore, and because their competitors were going in regardless. They were still completely outmaneuvered. The pattern was consistent across industry after industry. A foreign company signed a joint venture, trained Chinese engineers, shared its manufacturing processes. Then, a few years later, a Chinese competitor emerged with suspiciously familiar technology, selling at a fraction of the price, taking market share not just in China but globally. It happened in automobiles, high-speed trains, solar panels, wind turbines, and consumer electronics. The Chinese government had a name for what they were doing: trading market for technology. Foreign companies got access to consumers. China got the industrial foundations to build world-class industries of its own. By 2010, China was the world's largest manufacturer of solar panels, an industry it barely had in 2000. By 2015, its high-speed rail network was larger than the rest of the world's combined, built substantially on technology absorbed from foreign joint ventures. Western companies got sales. China got industries. Then came the manufacturing wave. In the 1990s, Western boardrooms discovered a simple logic. Why make something in Ohio when you can make it in Guangdong for a fifth of the cost? Consulting firms built practices around helping corporations move production to China. Shareholders demanded it. Between 1990 and 2010, China's share of global manufacturing went from under 3% to over 19%. By 2020, it was approaching 30%, nearly a third of everything made on Earth. Western companies had not just outsourced production. They had outsourced capability. The factory engineers, the supply chains, the industrial knowledge, it had all migrated to China. You can move a factory back. You cannot move back 20 years of institutional knowledge in 20 months. When you make a third of the world's goods and sell them globally, the money accumulates. China's trade surplus grew to over $300 billion a year by the mid-2000s. Foreign exchange reserves hit $3 trillion, the largest in human history. What do you do with $3 trillion? You invest it. China's primary investment was in U.S. Treasury bonds. At its peak, China held over $1.3 trillion in American government debt. Let that land for a moment. The West had spent 2 centuries trying to sell things to China. Instead, China sold things to the West, accumulated the proceeds, and lent them back to Western governments, which used that money to finance the spending that kept Western consumers buying more Chinese products. It is a feedback loop of breathtaking elegance. China was not just the world's factory anymore. It was the world's bank. And holding $1 trillion of another country's debt is a form of power, even when it is never exercised. The West had been trying to open China as a market. What it had accidentally created was a creditor. By 2013, China had so much surplus capital it could not absorb it all at home. So Xi Jinping announced the Belt and Road Initiative, the most ambitious infrastructure investment program in human history. Chinese banks lent to developing countries across Africa, Southeast Asia, and South America to build ports, railways, and power plants. China got commodities, strategic geography, and diplomatic relationships in return. The arc is worth pausing on. In the 1840s, Western powers extracted unequal treaties from China, forcing open ports on unfavorable terms. By the 2010s, China was writing the terms of deals across 3 continents. The one-way street had reversed direction and widened. Here is where the story comes full circle. The original fantasy, 400 million Chinese consumers, eventually came true. By the 2010s, China had the largest middle class on Earth by absolute numbers. Hundreds of millions of people with smartphones, credit cards, and serious appetite for consumption. Apple was selling more iPhones in China than anywhere else. European luxury brands, Louis Vuitton, Gucci, Porsche, had become structurally dependent on Chinese buyers. Hollywood redesigned films for Chinese audiences. The dream the Manchester Mill owners had in 1840 finally arrived. But it arrived at precisely the moment the geopolitical relationship began to collapse. The technology competition had turned serious. Huawei had become the world's largest supplier of network equipment. Chinese AI, solar, electric vehicles, and semiconductors were no longer playing catch-up. In some categories, they were ahead. The West responded with export controls, investment restrictions, and calls to de-risk supply chains. Companies found themselves trapped between 2 governments pulling in opposite directions. Say the wrong thing about Taiwan, and your Shanghai stores get boycotted. Fail to move your supply chain out of China, and your own government questions your loyalty. But move it where, exactly? Vietnam and India can absorb some volume. Neither has the infrastructure, the industrial ecosystem, or the 30 years of accumulated capability that China built. The door that was kicked open in 1842, reopened in 1978, and pried wide by 10,000 corporate supply chain decisions in the 1990s, turned out to be almost impossible to close. There is a version of this story told as a tale of Western naivety. We were foolish to trust China, foolish to transfer technology, foolish to build dependencies. That version gets the incentives wrong. No individual Western company made a foolish decision. Each one rationally pursued its own interests. The automaker that entered a joint venture in 1995 made a reasonable bet. The retailer that sourced from Guangdong in 2000 was chasing margin. The fund that bought treasury bonds lent to China was chasing yield. Every individual decision was rational. The collective result was a geopolitical transformation that nobody planned and nobody would have chosen if they could see the endpoint in advance. China, by contrast, had a plan. Not a perfect one. There were failures and course corrections. But there was a coherent national purpose. Use foreign capital and technology to build Chinese industrial strength, on Chinese terms for Chinese ends. The difference was not cleverness versus naivety. It was coordinated strategy versus fragmented individual interest. In 1842, Britain forced China to open a door. For 100 years, that door mostly let humiliation in. In 1978, China chose to reopen that same door. But on its own terms, with a 40-year plan it largely executed with extraordinary discipline. What came through the second time was not a grateful developing nation growing toward liberal democracy. It was a civilization that had spent a century being broken by the global economy and 4 decades learning exactly how that economy worked. Its pressure points, its collective action failures, its blind spots, and positioning itself at the center of it. The West spent 2 centuries trying to open China as a market. China used that effort to become a manufacturer, a creditor, a technology power, and a rule setter in an order it did not build but learned to navigate better than the people who did. The door is still open. What surprises most people is which direction the traffic is flowing.